We've got some breaking news. Bloomberg's Jennifer Jacobs reports that the U.S. will indeed ban imports of Russian oil and gas, with an official White House announcement now expected at 10:45 a.m. this morning. This comes only days after Axios' Hans Nichols reported that President Biden is considering a visit this spring to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia with, quote, hat in hand. The bending of the knee is aimed at coaxing the kingdom's de facto ruler, Mohammed bin Salman, into increasing oil output with the goal of reducing gas prices. The potential trip comes after The Intercept reported in February that Saudi King Salman had rejected Biden's previous request to increase output. During the campaign, Biden was particularly harsh on MBS, promising to end support for the war in Yemen and slamming him as a pariah for the murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi.
Khashoggi was, in fact, murdered and dismembered, and I believe in the order of the Crown Prince. And I would make it very clear, we were not going to, in fact, sell more weapons to them. We were going to, in fact, make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are. There's very little social redeeming value in the present government in Saudi Arabia. And I would also, as pointed out, I would end the subsidies that we have, end the sale of material to the Saudis, who they're going in and murdering children and they're murdering innocent people. And so they have to be held accountable.
On Monday, Democratic Congressman Tom Malinowski cited Saudi's role in tightening production for high gas prices, saying one reason we're paying $4 a gallon for gas is that a Saudi prince is angry that we criticized him for murdering a Washington Post journalist. If the alternative to relying on a Russian tyrant's oil is a Saudi tyrant's oil, well, maybe we should be less reliant on oil. Following the news of Biden's planned trip, Representative Ilhan Omar pushed back, arguing our response to Putin's immoral war shouldn't be to strengthen our relationship with the Saudis, who are currently causing the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet in Yemen. Yemenis might not matter to some geopolitically, but their humanity should. This is a wildly immoral act. Joining us now is Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. We're so happy to have you with us. You're our first guest in studio since the pandemic began, so welcome.
Glad to be here.
So can you elaborate, on the comments you made? Obviously, we've been very critical on the show of, and everyone's been critical, obviously, of Saudi Arabia and their behavior. But are we in an environment now where, we don't have the luxury of taking this stance against them, given the reality of what's going on with Russia?
Yeah, look, I hardly see a principled stance here, right? If our issue is that we are unwilling to buy oil from a dictator who is waging a war on a weaker neighboring country, I can hardly see where the principle is in going to Saudi Arabia and cozying up to another tyrant.
And you've been kind of outspoken about the way that the media has covered the suffering of Ukrainian people, talking about their blue eyes and this is in Europe, and Europe's such a peaceful nation, suggesting that it's different than other conflicts around the world. So it is interesting that some of the conditions do seem to be the same. You have a dictator kind of attacking another country. How much resonance are you finding that argument has among your colleagues at this point, saying, look, if it's wrong for Putin to bomb Ukraine, it's also wrong for Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen? What is that resonating with your colleagues?
I hope it is. I think, we tend to think that we approach these issues in a moral way. We say we are in the business of defending democracy, we are in the business of defending human rights. And if that's the case, it doesn't make any sense to me that we are so eager to condemn Putin, right, who is waging an immoral war. But we are not when it comes to the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. We have over 200 million Yemenis that are displaced in this given moment. There are about 8 million Yemenis that are in the brink of starvation. Over 300,000 Yemenis have been killed since the start of that war. 11,000 of them are children. We've seen pictures time and time again of the devastation this war in Yemen has had on innocent lives. but you don't see sanctions being imposed on Saudi Arabia or the Emirates. We continue to do business with them. Biden had said that MPS is a pariah. Apparently, he's not, because we are still friends with him. We're still in communications with him. When I introduced my legislation to sanction MPS, there was a pushback from the White House and the State Department that said, we are not going to do that. We still went ahead and sold weapons to them. This is a contradiction and a hypocrisy, and we have to be willing to call that out.
Well, and we have some footage of Biden, in fact, pledging to end the war in Yemen. Let's play that.
This war has to end. And to underscore our commitment, we are ending all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales.
But is the reality just that, as much as we would like to do that, I don't know if Americans are going to be willing to pay so much more for gas, right? So what's the alternative if we're taking this hard stance against Russia, and if we were to maintain our stance against Saudi Arabia? What is the alternative for giving the American people something they can live with, or else, like, the Biden administration is going to be finished if gas prices are so high? The reelection options are very limited.
Yeah, I mean, there's two different things, right? There's the moral argument and the political argument. If we're making the moral argument, obviously this is against our principles to go down this route. If we're making the political argument, we have an opportunity to lessen our dependency on oil and fossil fuels. We certainly know that renewable energies are more consistently reliable, and we know that they are cost effective. The measures, for example, that we passed within the Build Back Better will save about $500 for the American people. We also know that there are clear opportunities ahead of us in transitioning to renewable energy if we choose to go down that path.
On the fossil fuel front, the White House sent a delegation recently to Venezuela, opening up conversations with them. Apparently, and Maduro said publicly that if the United States wants to buy Venezuelan oil, he's more than happy to sell it to the United States. The refineries in the Gulf are built specifically for Venezuelan crude. And there's also the ongoing talks with Iran. We get reports that 95% of the way there, that could be, 1 million barrels a day or something coming out of Iran back onto the market. Would you support normal relations with both of those countries in order to balance out what's not coming from Russia?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that we are going to Venezuela and that the Biden administration officials are going to be visiting and they're going to have a conversation. I do hope that when they are there, that they do get to have a conversation with the Venezuelan people and see the devastation that our sanctions have had on the people, and get to realize that, our crippling sanctions on Venezuela hasn't weakened Maduro's position, and that this is a turning point for us when we are having conversations about the kind of sanctions that we impose, and get rid of this notion that somehow crippling sanctions will lead to regime change and uprising within the people that are economically devastated, that they will ultimately have a democracy. It hasn't happened in Cuba. It hasn't happened in Iran. It certainly hasn't happened in Venezuela. And I think the Iran case is very different, right? Because we are trying to stop them from developing nuclear weapons. And as we are watching what's happening right now in Russia, it is always a good thing to not have a nuclear powered country that is an adversary to us.
Well, do you think this, what you just outlined, the sanctions not working in the long term, creating regime change, does that mean our current strategy with Russia does not necessarily bode well, trying to punish them, to some extent punishing not just the regime but the Russian people? how confident or hopeful are you in the strategy that's being pursued right now is going to bring an end, to the conflict in Ukraine without us getting more involved or doing like a no-fly zone, which, most people, most political figures in both parties are, I think, wisely against.
Yeah, we certainly should not have a no-fly zone on the table as we have these conversations. Look, I support sanctions on Putin and his allies. I think when you engage in an immoral war, there should be consequences. But do I think that the broad-based sanctions that we are imposing on Russia is going to have a devastating impact on Putin? No, I think they're going to have a devastating impact on the people. And if we say we support, Russians who are anti-war, who are taking it to the streets, we ultimately do not want to have sanctions that are going to hurt their lives and livelihoods. And I think that there has to be a balancing act, and we can't continue to deploy the same playbook that has failed us over and over again. There has to be a measured way that we engage. Obviously, sanctions is a tool within our toolbox, and we have to use that tool in the most sufficient way that is not going to create more enemies for us and have a devastating consequence. So just as an example, Ukraine and Russia combined produce 30% of the world's wheat. Right? And as we talk about hunger in Africa and many parts of the Middle East, people are dependent on it, whether it is Sudan, whether it's Ethiopia and other places. And so if wheat production is impacted with these sanctions, we're going to have more people that are fleeing. We're going to have more refugees in a time where we have the highest number of displaced people in the history of the world. We can't add to that.
And you talked about the pivot to clean energy. Joe Manchin recently said, hey, look, if we do a certain amount of tax increases, I'm fine with spending half of that on whatever Democrats want to spend it on. It's up to you guys to decide. He said, it seems like you want to do environment. By environment, he means the climate spending. It's about $700 billion or so. That's nowhere near what the original Build Back Better Act was. But if he's being serious, do you think progressives in the House would say, okay, let's take that deal if it's on the table? And do you have any indications of how serious he is? Have there been back channel conversations to sort out, was this just chatter in the hallway, or is this real? Can we start writing legislation?
I mean, until we start writing legislation, the seriousness of anything Joe Manchin says needs to be taken with a grain of salt, right? This is not somebody whose word can be taken serious. I think the Progressive Caucus is ready and eager to engage in any conversation that moves us in the direction of moving away from our dependency on fossil fuel. And I'm not aware of any conversations that have been started outside of the remarks that he's made last Sunday.
We understand that President Biden is going to announce, this ban on Russian oil imports later today, I think. What do you make of that strategy? Does that fit in with the, punishing Putin specifically in the short term? But won't that also have, devastating economic consequences also for the people of Russia? So what do you think?
Yeah,
about
that's
it?
not only going to have a devastating impact of the people of Russia, but on Europe as well.
Right.
I think that when we are having these conversations, they can't be about just the immediate gratifying response that we want to come up with, right? Whether it is politically or morally, we have to think about what this means a year from now, what this means 2 years, 3 years from now, and I think ultimately this is not going to end well for the actual people of Russia, and it's not going to end well for the people of Europe as well.
So you would be a no on that, on banning Russian oil, or a yes temporarily? Do you think it will come to the House floor? I know the Ways and Means Committee was working in a bipartisan fashion to craft some type of legislation. I don't know if the White House can just simply do it.
My understanding is that there is a legislation that we might be considering sometime today or tomorrow, and that legislation does not just have a ban on oil, but it has other undesirable sanctions that I will not be supporting.
And what do you make of the offer made by Putin yesterday that Zelensky rejected, but said he was open to entertaining parts of it? And the offer was basically you have to rewrite your constitution to make Ukraine neutral. You have to include in the constitution that these two separatist republics are now independent republics, and you have to recognize Crimea. Maybe there was a couple other smaller things. So they rejected the overall offer, but he did say he was open to talking about the separatist regions and the status of those. Where do you come down on that question? Because ultimately, on the one hand, it's for Ukrainians to decide, but on the other hand, it's for the world to decide at what point we're continuing to be willing to go to war or economic war. And do those separatist regions rise to that level?
I mean, I think Zelensky is smart to reject the proposal that I think is very naive and stupidified on some level to think that you can dictate the rewriting of a constitution for a country, or that you can decide its borders. And there was some suggestion about appointing a prime minister. It just sounds ridiculous to me. I mean, I don't think we would accept that as American citizens if some country was doing that. I don't think anybody would accept it from us if we were to dictate those kind of things. But I do think that there has to be, right, a decision that is made by the Ukrainians on what they're willing to accept and negotiate in order to have peace. The amount of destruction that is taking place in their country by the Russians is appalling and heartbreaking. The number of people who are fleeing, that is now, I think, close to 2 million within just a little over a week, is something that we haven't seen in my lifetime. And I think, at some point, we have to get serious about, how do we get in the business of advancing peace.
Yeah, Putin has said that even the current level of sanctions, this was even before the oil import ban, has said that is akin to an act of war. How seriously or nervously should we take the fact that we have this nuclear superpower, doing this unconscionable invasion of a neighboring country, and we the U.S. do not want to get into World War III, obviously, where you maybe have millions or billions of people dying, but also it cannot be okay for Russia to, there would come a point where we would have to do more than we're doing now if Russia were to just start marching across Europe. So do we assume that Putin is a rational actor and does not want to escalate into nuclear conflict, and we can try to figure out his strategy from that sense, or is there an actual concern that I hear like he's gone off the deep end, he's suicidal, that kind of stuff? I don't really think that's the case, but what is your interpretation? Yeah,
I mean, I do think that we have to take the threats that he's making we have to take them seriously, and I know that we did take the threats he made previously more serious, maybe even more seriously than the Ukrainians did, and I think it's important to realize that at this point, every threat that he makes needs to be responded to in a measured way. Because what we ultimately don't want to do is react in a way that escalates this war and escalates his reactions to, the actions that we take. Diplomacy doesn't end when war begins. The engagement in diplomacy has to continue. I think our administration, NATO allies, the Ukrainians, the Russians, everybody needs to continue to engage in diplomacy. The longer this war continues, the more destruction it will be for the Ukrainians, and the more that there is going to be a destruction to world order.
And you mentioned earlier the Emirati's role in the Yemen war. The UAE has also, as you know, long been a haven for Russian oligarchs. And over the last 12 days or so, they've really rolled out the red carpet. You can just follow the oligarch plane tracker. Lots of people heading over to Dubai. Yeah, this Florida college student started one. It's great. It's a Twitter account where you can follow the oligarchs all around the planet.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Wow, okay.
And so many of them are winding up in Dubai, where they already had tons of their assets parked because it has become this kind of money laundering haven for the global economy. Is the U.S. putting any pressure on the Emiratis for their responsibility in creating a safe space for these oligarchs as the world is coming down on them, or are we looking the other way right now?
I think when it comes to the Emiratis, we have always looked away. The Saudis and the Emiratis had a big role in crushing the uprisings in Bahrain and other parts of the Middle East. The Emiratis have had a role in the coup in Sudan. They continue to have a role in destabilizing Libya. They continue to have a role in what's the conflict in Tigray. In Ethiopia, they continue to have a role in my own home country, Somalia. They have a role in everything.
To overthrow the Jordanian government.
The Jordanian government, and we remain silent. And we, as recently as a few months ago, sold them weapons, and with little consideration for their brazen, disturbing actions across the Middle East and Africa. And so to think now that we, somehow would condemn them for the actions that they are taking in rolling out the red carpet, as you said, for the oligarchs in Russia, to me just isn't a feasible thing. I do hope that the administration does get serious about our relationship with the Emirates, our relationship with Saudi Arabia, because we can't continue to say, we are doing everything that we can to defend democracy in Ukraine while our best friends are, dictators in the Middle East who jail dissidents, who kill journalists, who sell their drones to kill children, who are overthrowing governments, who are crushing uprisings and allowing for whole regions to be destabilized, and using their resources, their oil that we buy from them, to do so.
It can feel like our government is playing a board game, like it's Risk or something. On this turn, you're allied with these people and fighting these people. On your next turn, maybe it's different.
Pick a dictator for today.
Right, exactly. Well, Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us. As I said, you're our first in-studio guest in 2 years, so we're so happy to have you.
Yeah, thank you.
Up next, Kim Iverson will join us with author Tom Hartman to discuss his new book, The Hidden History of Big Brother in America. Stick around.